Hey, YCIS, it's Mr. Hackman here, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different this morning. This won't be the normal assembly. We're going to have some special activities that are incorporated into this talk, something you're going to be able to do a little bit afterwards, which I'll explain in just a bit. Because obviously, this is a little bit different setup. We're not in a normal assembly. We're not even in what we've been doing the last few weeks in Zoom. You're sitting there on a Saturday morning, so it's going to be a little bit different. But let me just say from the big just at the beginning of this, it's been so good to see you back in school again. Just seeing your smiling faces, seeing people, seeing students, teachers teaching, just everything going the way the school's supposed to be going. I think it's been a challenging few months, both for students and staff. And as we come to the end of an academic year, we want to bring to a close, at least from CCDD and some of the things we've been imparting into the life of the school over this last academic year, just finishing off on what themes we've been introducing, namely the fruit of the Spirit. And many of you know, actually, all of you know, because you've all been in the assemblies. Over this year, we've been looking at love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self control, gentleness, faithfulness. And I've really tried to teach these in a way that would be not just kind of cheesy and not just, oh, it's a nice little thing we're supposed to do, but in a way that really brings life to you. You know, you've often heard me say that when Jesus came, when he was asked, why did you come? His answer was, I came to bring life to you. That not just life, but a life that's flourishing, a life that's abundant, a life that's special. So these attributes that Jesus talks about, these are not just um, little attributes that, oh, if you're a sweet person, you really should probably be doing more of these. But really, as these things grow in your life, they will bring a lot of joy and a lot of peace and a lot of life to you in a way that you couldn't have imagined. And not only to you, but when you're experiencing these things, it has a way of filtering out to those around you. I mean, let's face it, if you're with a person who's joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, don't you want to be around that kind of person? I mean, nobody wants to be around somebody who's not loving, not joyful, not self controlled. Nobody wants to be around that person. People want to be around others that exude these attributes that we've been talking about. And these attributes are things we can actually grow in us. We can practice them. We can, and we don't always get it right. Mr. Hackman doesn't always get it right. I'm not always peaceful. I'm not always patient. I'm not always kind. God knows I'm not always self controlled. But I really try. And I try very intentionally to build these things into my life. And when I do fail, when there's times where um, I sense that I'm not kind, I really try to reflect on that and look for a pattern, perhaps, of maybe something that I get myself into that allows me to develop like negative fruit, or just be thinking, how can I do this a little better next time? Maybe I need to apologize to somebody, or maybe I just need to um, just reflect on it and try to do better next time. One of the things is, you know, we call these the fruit of the Spirit. And there's one thing I got to say, like near the beginning here, and I should say as we close out the academic year. Um, you know, sometimes we can teach fruit of the Spirit, and if you've ever seen it taught before, you get it likened to fruit. You know, that fruit should grow in you, and you could say like love is like a banana, or you know, joy or self control is like an orange. But when these teachings originally went out 2,000 years ago, there was not big urban cities. There was not Hong Kongs. Yeah, there was, you know, there was Rome and Jerusalem and bigger cities. But by and large, most people lived in farming communities. They lived in areas where they were growing. Everyone was a farmer. Everyone was growing food. So well, I should just explain, Jesus talked about, you know, if you want to know the type of person someone is, you look at the fruit they're producing. And we've talked about this in previous assemblies, and he likens it to a tree. If you want to know what kind of fruit tree, if it's good, if it's healthy, if it's nourishing, then look at the fruit. If it's got good fruit, juicy fruit, delicious fruit, then you know the tree's good. If the fruit's not so good, If it's rotten, if it's old, if it's then there's something wrong with the tree. Um, Paul, Jesus's apostle, or the one who came after him to kind of explain Jesus's teachings better, um, got even more specific, talking about these different fruit being love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control, gentleness, and faithfulness. But again, Paul, when they're talking about the fruit of the Spirit, he's using a metaphor that everyone would understand. And I think, obviously, because we eat fruit and we're fairly familiar with fruit, it's a metaphor that kind of works for us in the 21st century in Hong Kong, but there might even be better metaphors for young people living in an urban setting. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit in context of when Paul, again, the apostle of Jesus, was teaching about these fruit of the Spirit, the context or the environment that he was speaking this to, the people he was speaking it to. Paul went around when there was no Christianity yet. Jesus had died, and he had told his apostles after he rose from the dead, "Go and share my teachings. Just take it everywhere. Go." He said, literally, go to the four corners of the earth, and that's what they did. All the students of Jesus went out, as the Bible said, and just started teaching about Jesus and what Jesus taught. And so Paul, who was one of the most prolific, when I say prolific, he wrote the most and he seemed to be the most visible. He did a lot of stuff. He founded a church in the city of Galatia, which is in modern day Turkey. After he left Galatia, obviously they didn't have cell phones back then. They didn't have the internet. So he would write letters to them to encourage them. And the Bible records one of these letters. It's Paul's letter to the Galatians. You can find it in the New Testament. It's called Galatians. And in that, he's literally writing to the church there that he had started. And he's trying to encourage them. But what had happened was Paul had gone into Galatia and he'd said, he talked about the freedom, the abundant life that I talked about earlier that Jesus brings. And the Galatians said, yeah, that's pretty cool. We'd like to know more about this Jesus, and we'd like to become Christians too. So they start a church, and there's a thriving church in Galatia. But what had happened then is Paul had heard later some other people had come in, and they were from the Jewish religion of which Jesus was part of. And we don't have to go into a lot of details here, but they started teaching these new Christians, oh, no, no, no. See, Jesus was Jewish. So if you want to be a Christian, you first have to be Jewish. And if you're going to be Jewish, you got to follow this rule, and you got to follow this rule, and you got to follow this rule. And so the Galatians got a little confused, and they're going, well, this is not what we signed up for. We thought we were following this Jesus who taught this, but you're saying in order to do this, we got to do this first. And so they got a little confused. So Paul writes them to kind of clear up the confusion. And so he writes in Galatians chapter 5. So Paul writes the Galatians this, and I'm going to use the Message translation of the Bible, which is a little more modern and uses words that I think you might relate to you more than the traditional language of the Bible. Paul says this: it's absolutely clear that God has called you to a free life. Just make sure that you don't use this freedom as an excuse to do whatever you want to do and destroy your freedom. Rather, use your freedom to serve one another in love. That's how freedom grows. For everything we know about God's word is summed up in a single sentence: love others as you love yourself. That's an act of true freedom. If you bite and ravage each other, watch out. In no time at all, you'll be annihilating each other. And then where will your precious freedom be then? So this whole beginning part that Paul says is, listen, you're free. But the problem is, if you just start doing whatever you want, you're going to start hurting people. And then what's it going to matter if you have freedom, if you're just destroying everything around you? And just a quick story is, around the world right now, there's a lot of bitterness in different countries over different areas. We've talked about this before. In my home country of America, the Democrats, the Republicans, the two sides, the political sides, are very polarized to the point where it is splitting families. They're so angry with one another. In the UK, it's with Brexit. In Hong Kong, we're seeing it happening again between, for lack of a better term, the yellow and the blue. And we can talk about freedom, as Paul says here, but if your freedom is tearing someone down rather than building them up, you're just going to end up lighting a fire to everything and forgetting it. It's interesting. I was at a birthday party last week. I just got to tell you a quick story. I was at a birthday party last week and I saw two friends. We were having a big dinner, and two friends started getting into a little political disagreement, and it started escalating at the table to the point where everybody was kind of watching this, and it got a little bit uncomfortable. And it was, for lack of a better term, between someone who was yellow and someone who was blue, and it was escalating, escalating, escalating. And the funny thing is, they were Westerners. They were, but they lived in Hong Kong so long. They've been living in Hong Kong longer than you've been alive. So they felt very passionate about the city and very passionate about some things that are going on right now. And so the reason I bring this up is, at the end, as angry as they got with one another, they calmed down and then they hugged, and they committed that their friendship was more important than their differences. And this is something I think is so crucial, and I think this is what Paul is trying to communicate to the Galatians. Like, listen, you can have a freedom to do this, that, and everything, but if you're breaking relationship with those around you, if you're not doing as Jesus says, and Paul says right here, everything can be summed up in one thing: love others as yourself. Always ask yourself, is what I doing bringing love to myself and those around me? Well, Paul goes on to say this. He says, my counsel is this, or my advice is this: live freely, animated, and motivated by God's Spirit. Just have a wonderful life. Live free. Then you won't feed the compulsions of selfishness. For there is a root of sinful self-interest in us that is at odds with a free spirit, just as the free spirit is incompatible with selfishness. So what Paul's saying is, there is this God part of you that wants to be free, that wants to live this abundant life, that brings real love and fulfillment to you, and that's fundamentally at odds with selfishness. Because often we think in order to get that, we've got to be selfish. We've got to think of number one first. But everything about God is almost inverted on itself. In order to achieve these things, this fulfillment, a lot of times I have to give to others around me. So then he says, these two ways of life are antithetical. I mean, they're at opposite ends with one another. So you cannot live at times one way and at times another way according to how you feel on any given day. Why don't you choose to be led by the Spirit, or the way God leads you, and so escape the erratic compulsions of a law-dominated existence? When he says a law-dominated existence, he means a rules-based. If you live your life only by, okay, I can tick the box of rules. I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. The problem is some days you're not able to do that. You're human. And then you think, oh, you start getting guilty. Oh, I'm not good enough. I haven't done this enough. And then you start acting out in ways to compensate for that, to make yourself feel better, which often can lead to destruction. Paul is saying, why don't you just forget all that? And why don't you just put all those little check boxes to the side sometimes and just live a life that brings beauty to yourself and those around you? And then he says, he gets really specific here. Like, the Galatians are probably thinking, oh, well, what do you mean by this, Paul? What's the bad stuff that you're talking about, that we try to compensate for these areas? Whenever we're feeling guilty or we're feeling empty, then we grasp for things to fill that emptiness. And he says it's obvious what kind of life develops out of trying to get your own way all the time. He says, repetitive, loveless, cheap sex, a stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage, frenzied and joyless grabs for happiness, just trying to find happiness, nothing intentional. It's just grasping for something to fill the emptiness. trinket gods. And what he means by that is just getting involved with little stuff and giving yourself to things that you shouldn't be giving yourself to. Magic show religion, people get into this, and I can even see it done in some Christianity. Magic show religion, paranoid loneliness, cutthroat competition, all consuming yet never satisfied wants. You just get on that treadmill of, the carrot, or the treasure's always dangling out in front of you, but you can never quite reach it. You lack contentment, then a brutal temper, an impotence to love or to be loved. That's probably one of the worst. When you lose your ability to love or be loved, it's very difficult to live a fulfilling life. Divided homes and divided lives, small-minded and lopsided pursuits, the vicious habit of depersonalizing everyone into a rival. How many of us are a little guilty of that sometimes? Of turning everyone into a competitor around us. I'm at odds with people rather than seeing them as companions or fellow humans on this wonderful journey of life. Uncontrolled addictions, ugly parodies of community. I could go on, he says. He says, this isn't the first time I've warned you, If you use your freedom like this, you will not inherit God's kingdom. And he's not talking about, oh, when you die, you won't go to heaven. That's not what this is talking about. And I find too often, even Christians, they regulate or God's kingdom, like it's somewhere you go after you die. Now, everything about Jesus was talking about when these fruit that we're talking about are being produced in our lives, we begin to see and operate in the kingdom of God around us. So if you want to be able to walk in that reality, these things have to be coming out of you in ever increasing amounts. He says, but what happens when we live God's way? He brings gifts into our lives much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. And this is where he gives his own, instead of saying joy, compassion, goodness, self-control, he modernizes it. And I hope you can understand. So he says, it appears like fruit in the orchard, things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity, just a calmness and inner peace. We develop a willingness to stick with things, not to give up quickly, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way into life, able to marshal or to gather and direct our energies wisely, not just getting involved in anything that just saps your strength, but really directing your energy into something that is like life-giving and will produce something that will make your life even more uh, wonderful and beautiful. Sorry, people are walking by out there. I get distracted. Legalism is helping bring this about, as helpless, I'm sorry, in bringing this about. It only gets in the way. So anytime you just become a rules-based person, that's actually going to stop this from occurring. It's not going to be able to happen. So anyhow, I'm going to close with that. We're going to have a few activities that we'll explain in just a few minutes. But I'm going to show you a short video. And it's just I feel a wonderful video about young people at a school and how we can begin to, when we get caught up in producing these bad fruit, how we can make a change and maybe bring life to someone who is being bullied, someone who's being picked on, someone who needs help, and then how ultimately the person who makes the change in their heart, uh, like I said before, whenever you're giving or these fruit to others, it's often you yourself who benefits the most from it. So take a look at this film. Yeah, it's just a beautiful story. I think there's something we can all relate to. I remember these types of things occurring when I was a young person, and I know they happen now. So I hope that in your day to day, if you see someone who is um, the target of bullying, the target of just being picked on like this, begin to produce these fruit in yourself so that you can give them to someone who needs them, and then bring life to yourself and those around you. That's going to cap off this year's teaching on fruit of the spirit. We've got some activities here for you. What we've got is Miss K's one of the options you have, and you can do any combination of these. But Miss K's has got a melody, a song that she's written. What she wants you to do is produce your own song along this melody that talks about the fruit of the spirit and maybe how it could interact in your life. Also, Mr. Tung has some activities, some fun things to do. Crossword, I think some coloring, some things you can do that highlight the fruit of the spirit. And then Mr. Eric's new to CCDD. He has some reflection questions, some things to consider, and to fill out and have you process some of the things we've been learning as we've talked about these attributes in our lives that we can begin to have grow in us. So why don't you spend the next 20 to 30 minutes working on these activities, and then and as always, we're looking forward to come visit our new location on the 5th floor in the B block. We're got a new location there, so come visit us. Anyhow, we're going to close this time as we always do with a prayer before we go into the activities. God of hope and healing, at this time of a virus outbreak, give courage and healing to the sick, patience to the suffering, and comfort to the anxious. Grant those in authority and the medical personnel wisdom and sensitivity to manage the situation. Pour your love upon us so that we may be an encouragement and a help for each other at this time of need. Abide with us in our going out and our coming in. Protect us all and give us the assurance of your faith, hope, and love. We offer our prayer to Jesus Christ, in whose name wholeness, salvation, and peace come. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. God bless, and we'll see you in school this week. Bye-bye.